Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to give people just a second to get into the waiting room, from the waiting room into the Zoom. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tiernan Sittenfeld, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs with the League of Conservation Voters. I'm here on behalf of LCV, Climate Power, the Climate Action Campaign, and people in every state across this country who are calling on Congress to make once-in-a-generation progress on climate action, environmental justice, and good-paying union jobs. We're about to hear from some incredible leaders from the House of Representatives who are all in to ensure that Congress meets the moment on climate and gets the job done in the coming weeks. Representatives Suzan DelBene from Washington, Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, Jahana Hayes from Connecticut, Katie Porter from California, and Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey. Last year was the 5th hottest year on record, and people across our nation suffered from deadly and devastating climate-fueled extreme weather throughout the year. In December alone, which was the 2nd hottest month of December on record, tornadoes tragically killed 78 people in Kentucky, and catastrophic fires in Colorado destroyed 1,000 homes, months past the typical end of fire season. We simply cannot afford the staggering costs of inaction on climate. It has never been more urgent or more important for Congress to address this code red for humanity. And we applaud the House for passing the Build Back Better Act to do just that. But it's been more than 2 months since that exciting day in the House. It's time for the Senate to finalize and pass the best and most comprehensive version of Build Back Better that centers climate and can get 50 votes. The Senate must do this to put our nation on track to meet the test of cutting climate pollution in half by 2030, the goal set by President Biden and that science and environmental and racial justice require. The Senate must do this to avert even more devastation in the future and to make a huge difference in people's everyday lives starting right away. This legislation will invest in the frontline and communities of color that have suffered the most from toxic pollution. It will create and sustain millions of good-paying jobs in the clean energy economy, and it will save people money on their energy bills and other monthly expenses. Our speakers today come from different parts of the country and represent different kinds of districts and lead or belong to different congressional caucuses. But they are all standing up for their communities that are being harmed by the climate crisis, and they all share a fierce determination to get the job done. We're so grateful for their leadership and eager to hear from them now, starting with Congresswoman DelBene, the chair of the New Dems. Then we'll hear from Representatives Spanberger and Hayes, then Deputy Chair of the Progressive Caucus, Porter, and then Problem Solvers co-chair Gottheimer, all 4 of whom signed on to their colleague, Representative Mike Levin's frontliner climate letter to the president this morning. Thank you all, and Congresswoman DelBene, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from the Great Northwest. And before I begin, I want to thank Tiernan, Climate Power, and the League of Conservation Voters for organizing today's event. I'm honored to be here with my colleagues, Representatives Spanberger, Porter, Hayes, and Gottheimer, to call for a strong agreement on a final Build Back Better Act that tackles the climate crisis and protects our planet for future generations. Every year, the effects of climate change hit closer to home, and unfortunately, 2021 was no exception. Last year, we witnessed one extreme weather event after another in communities across the country, from ice storms in Texas to flash floods on the East Coast. The loss of lives and livelihoods has been severe. In my own district in the Pacific Northwest, we've had record heat, extreme winter storms, and heavy flooding that have taken a devastating toll. Sadly, this is our new reality. Reportedly, more than 40% of Americans live in counties hit by climate disasters in 2021. So the cost of inaction is too high. Last year, climate-related disasters cost the US $145 billion alone. And this number is projected to reach $500 billion a year by the end of the century. Not only that, we're also missing out on the economic growth, jobs, and opportunities of leading the global fight against climate change. That's why we must pass a final Build Back Better Act that tackles the climate crisis and positions the US to lead the global transition to a climate-forward economy of the future. Congressional Democrats are united in our support of passing climate investments in this package. As the chair of the 97-member New Democrat Coalition, I know combating climate change is important for every one of our members. Since the beginning, New Dems have made big, bold climate action one of our top priorities for the Build Back Better Act. We pushed for and secured policies in this package that would create American jobs, cut energy costs for families, build a more resilient future, and significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions to move us towards our goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. In November, we made American history by passing the Build Back Better Act in the House, which included the largest effort to combat climate change. But our work isn't done. In order to deliver on climate, we must agree on a bill that can get 218 votes in the House and 50 votes in the Senate. New Dems believe there's a path forward by building on the existing areas of agreement and focusing on doing a few things well for longer. There is broad consensus among Democrats on these climate priorities, and we'll do everything in our power to ensure the Build Back Better Act prioritizes climate and is signed into law. The time to act is now, and failure is not an option. Now I want to turn it over to my colleague and fellow New Dem, Representative Abigail Spanberger from Virginia.
Thank you so very much for having me. I'm Abigail Spanberger, and I represent Virginia's 7th District. And my virtual background is the beauty that we have in our 7th District. And I'm so glad to be standing here with my colleagues virtually, as well as with LCV, to discuss and call on our colleagues to recognize the real severity and the urgency of this moment for our climate and for our future. Since arriving in Congress, I've had the privilege of working directly with Virginia's LCV members, and they are some of the strongest champions we have here in the country for the protection of our Commonwealth's air, water, and natural resources. I'm appreciative of the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to continuing to be one of the voices pushing for progress. Now, I am driven to address the reality of climate change because not doing so has profound and negative national security implications. Not doing so has significant economic ramifications when we are constantly responding from reactionary positions rather than making investments that are forward-looking. And not doing so has implications on the health of the American population and our communities. And not doing so is passing a problem on to our children that they deserve to have us take action on. So those are among the things that motivate me. But today I'm going to center my comments on Virginia's #1 private industry, which is agriculture. As the only Virginian on the Agriculture Committee, I have had the tremendous opportunity to regularly hear from Virginia's crop and livestock producers about what's working and what is not. I hear that they want to play a role in building a more resilient economy that reduces harm to our planet by embracing climate-smart agriculture and clean, renewable energy, and inexpensive renewable energy. And as chair of the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee, I have had the chance to dig into the success of our nation's voluntary conservation programs. And I know where we can make additional investments in incentive-based conservation programs that have a real impact on our climate and on our rural communities. And I know that we have the opportunity to make a once-in-a-generation investment in climate-smart agriculture overall. Many of these programs are oversubscribed or underfunded, which limits the number of American producers who can participate in these successful conservation initiatives. And underinvesting in these programs hurts our economy. It hurts our rural communities, and it prevents the American farmer from staying competitive in the global marketplace and in being part of the nature-based solutions that are so important to our long-term fight against climate change. The House Agriculture Committee's portion of the Build Back Better Act that we passed out of the House showed us how we can responsibly strengthen federal investments in voluntary farm, ranch, and forest conservation programs while combating the climate crisis. It also demonstrated how we should renew our support for reforestation and wetlands restoration across the country. And as negotiations continue, we have an opportunity to understand the successes of conservation in American agriculture and then double down. We can bring an extra level of dedication to the time-tested stewardship practices like rotational grazing, improved fertilizer efficiency, and cover cropping. These programs are not partisan, and they are not punching bags for attack ads. They are programs with a demonstrated record of success for our farmers and for our planet. And our farmers trust in the potential of voluntary conservation programs, and we should deliver on finally allowing them to bring the highest potential of results to rural America and results that impact us all. What's more, the climate provisions we passed out of the House as part of the House-passed Build Back Better Act made record investments in the efficiency across the country, cut emissions from our transportation sector, and combat environmental injustice by investing in a cleaner environment for all communities. Through these smart investments in our grid and our tax incentives to help deploy clean energy, this legislation will help to lower energy costs for families and small businesses across the country. And because clean energy is inexpensive energy, it is good for their bottom line and our planet. Over the last few years, we've seen firsthand how extreme weather fueled by the climate change we are all experiencing has not only disrupted lives of those in our communities, but exacerbated long-term challenges facing our country's air, soil, and water. And we needed to deliver investments in climate-smart practices that build on the tremendous work of our farmers who are already working to build a healthier climate. We need to invest in a cleaner grid, cleaner transportation systems, and we need to make sure that our rural businesses and overall communities are not left behind as we work to rebuild our economy in the wake of the pandemic. I thank you all for having me, and I am now proud to pass the baton to my colleague from Connecticut, Representative Jahana Hayes.
Thank you so much, Representative Spanberger, and thank you for League of Conservation Women Voters for calling this event. One thing that I will say, I think in this area of just climate practices and how do we address the challenges that we have, I think the audience for this has expanded exponentially. This is no longer just a conversation for climate activists. I think that every group and every decision that we make as members of Congress has to take into account the impact that we will have, the long-term impact that we will have on our environments and our communities. This is no longer a single issue conversation. How the climate impact of legislation has to be incorporated into everything that we do. I also sit on the Committee of Agriculture with Representative Spanberger, and the largest industry in my district, believe it or not, is greenhouses. I've recently visited greenhouses, and they are expanding the conversation to include how can they produce vegetables so that we can be responsive to severe climate events. So every industry is really trying to look at their response to future climate events, from the building and trades industry to the agriculture industry. But the area that is deeply personal for me, I mean, all of these, every piece of legislation in the Build Back Better Act, I think Democrats were deliberate and intentional about how we approach these issues. But as an educator, there are some things that really stand out for me in the Build Back Better plan. One of the things that I was surprised is how hard we had to fight to get clean drinking water into these plans. We have to think of legislation and think of water as infrastructure. This is something that should be a non-negotiable. I remember my days as a teacher when there were water fountains in our school that were covered with plastic and said just simply do not use because we had lead in our pipes. That should not be happening in America in 2021. Throughout my travels, as a lot of this is from personal experience, but these are some of the things that I saw as a teacher when I visited African nations. It should not be a modern day problem in America that our children have to face. So making sure that water is a part of our planning, a part of our infrastructure, a part of our environmental plan should be a simple thing that we can all agree on. One of the things that I have been deeply passionate about is making sure that kids had access to clean air while they were in school, a place that should be safe. The Build Back Better Act includes $50 million to reduce air pollution, especially in disadvantaged schools and communities. Oftentimes when people visit schools, it is the most modern campus at the best site in the school district. But I can tell you from personal experiences, once again, that many of our children are studying in basement classrooms with windows that don't open, with poor air quality and ventilation. Those are things that we have to address. This is also has to be part of our climate solution. I pushed really hard to make sure that we transferred our school bus fleet from diesel to electric. so many of my students would be out of school. I worked in a Title I urban public school district, and asthma was the leading cause of illness, the leading reason for out of school absences, the leading reason for hospitalization among school age kids in my community. These are things that are preventable and that we can work to address and to avoid. If you've ever stood in a bus line, you know that you're on the receiving end of diesel fuel for 45 minutes in the morning and in the afternoon. And, you know, while you're standing there at bus duty, just imagine our children are riding those buses, sometimes for hours at a time. These are things that we should all be able to agree on. So I am so incredibly proud to be a part of a Congress that prioritizes these issues and looks at them not as aspirational goals or left-leaning policies, but necessary actions that we all have to engage in to make sure this is done. I think to that point, this panel is really speaks volumes about the commitment to this work. The fact that we have, you know, the full spectrum from the new Dems to the progressives on a call, agreeing about the same thing, and our steps and the actions that we have to take really speaks to the urgency of this matter. I'm so just proud to join this group of my esteemed colleagues in this important and critical work to make sure that our children are safe, our communities are safe, and that we are good stewards over the environment with long-term plans. And with that, I will hand it off to my colleague and friend, Representative Porter, who's been a champion on this issue.
Thank you so much, Jahana, and I'm really feeling more and more inspired as I listen to the different perspectives on this call, the perspective from agriculture, the perspective from education. You know, in California, we know firsthand the urgent need to take bold action on climate and what happens if you don't. I will never forget the Silverado fire that threatened my community at the start of this pandemic. There was dense smoke in the air, ash rained down on my home, and the sky was dark orange. And I remember how closely I watched my phone for emergency alerts, the fear of my children, the disruption to our public education system and healthcare system during that fire. It is real, and it is a constant threat here in California, and too often a real problem. 2020 and 2021 were among the most destructive years for California wildfires ever recorded. More than 6.9 million acres burned in the state. In Orange County, the Silverado fire and then the bonfire ravaged more than 20,000 acres, threatened tens of thousands of buildings, and forced many families to evacuate in the middle of a global pandemic. And it's not just a problem until the fire is under control or extinguished. It's the mudslides that come afterwards. It's the debris that is created, the loss of home, the risk of homelessness, and the health issues and effects that continue. Now, over the past few months, it feels like longer than that. Over the past several months, climate skeptics and so-called budget hawks have tried to claim that the cost of environmental action in the Build Back Better Act is too high. What they are not being honest with the American people about is the cost of doing nothing and continuing business as usual. Scientists have shown that climate change leads to increasingly worse natural disasters. Wildfires are just one example of several others. Weather and climate-related disasters cost taxpayers $145 billion in 2021 alone. It's fiscally irresponsible not to take action to mitigate these natural disasters, to prevent them, and to fight against the climate crisis. We simply cannot afford to keep stalling on climate action. The price, if we do not act today, is just going to keep going up. Worsening natural disasters are not the only costly effect of climate change. We know that heat-related illnesses have increased, insect-borne diseases have become more widespread, and asthma rates have skyrocketed. But if we take action now, we can make a real difference. The American Lung Association estimates that reaching zero-emission transportation by 2050 would reduce air pollution and avoid $72 billion in healthcare costs. The Build Back Better Act that passed the House includes billions of dollars for investments in clean energy, climate resilience, and conservation of our public lands. The climate crisis is real, It is not going to go away just because Washington fails to act. The legislation, the policies in the Build Back Better Act would not only help prepare our country to fight the climate crisis, but they would help meet the needs of the American people on childcare, elder care, healthcare, education, and so much more. The Build Back Better Act is about making our economy stronger, more stable, and more globally competitive. And that is something that benefits every American, regardless of their ideology or partisanship. As we've noted, my colleagues and I here today represent very different districts. We serve on very different committees, but we are here today united in getting strong climate change policy across the finish line because the costs of inaction are too great. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Josh Gottheimer.
Thank you, Congressman Porter. Thank you for your remarks. And it's great to be here with my colleagues, Congressman DelBene and Congressman Spanberger and Tiernan LCV. Thank you so much for your excellent leadership. Very, very grateful. It really is an honor to be here to discuss the concrete steps that we need to take, that we must take to protect our air and our water and our open spaces for our kids and our grandkids. Practical, pragmatic, common sense action, our fight for the future of our communities and our planet. When you talk about fighting climate change at first, it seems like an insurmountable task. But when you dig into it, you realize pretty quickly that we can take immediate steps now that will have both a short-term and a long-term impact on our lives, on our health, on our economy, and of course, on our planet. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, which we passed in November, now law, was made historic investments in bolstering our climate resiliency to deal with once-in-a-century flooding, fires, and storms that have cost New Jersey more than $50 billion in the last 10 years alone. Just look at Hurricane Ida and what it did to Jersey in my district, flooding homes, businesses, and schools, washing roadways away and bridges, and sadly taking many, many lives. These costs will only get worse if we don't continue to act and act urgently. In 2020 alone, US taxpayers saw more than $100 billion in costs from climate-related disasters. And over the past 5 years, these costs totaled more than $600 billion. Not to mention wildfires have burned more than 6.5 million acres in 2021, as Congressman Porter talked about, costing nearly $90 billion. The cost of inaction is simply too high. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, which Democrats and Republicans came together around to pass, will also help get the lead out of our children's drinking water, support our Superfund sites, and build the electric vehicle infrastructure we need for the next generation of vehicles, helping ensure we are fighting climate change as we build the next generation of infrastructure. And as Representative Hayes rightly said, it is outrageous in this day and age that we still have children worrying about the drinking water out of the fountains in our schools. It's completely outrageous, the lead and PFAS and other chemicals that are affecting our children and their health and our families. Now we have another important and critical opportunity to take more steps that we desperately need. We have the opportunity to deliver another critical piece of the puzzle in our fight against climate change. As we work to build a version of the Build Back Better Act that we can get across the finish line, we must ensure that this legislation includes key incentives for families to move over to electric vehicles, for wind and solar power, and for utilities to upgrade their power grids and transition to clean energy sources. And we can do all this while cutting taxes and costs for hardworking families by restoring the state and local tax deduction and making pre-K universal and childcare affordable. Fighting climate change simply should not be a partisan issue. It's just something we must do and that makes sense for our country, for everyone. We work to pass additional legislation in this Congress, including a new version of the Build Back Better Act. I'm committed to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure that we are taking the right steps we need to protect our planet. Fighting for clean air and clean water on our planet that our kids and grandkids can live in is something that's been a focus of mine since before I was in Congress. And it's something that's actually critical now and that we cannot afford to wait. There is no time to delay. For Jersey, for our planet, we must take action to tackle climate change now to make sure that our best days will always be ahead of us in the greatest country in the world. Thank you so much. Now I yield back to LCV.
Thank you so much, Congressman Gottheimer. Thank you to all of our incredible speakers for fighting so hard to get the job done, to meet the climate test, to center climate, jobs, and justice. We are with you at every step and so grateful to Congresswoman DelBene, to Congresswoman Hayes, to Congresswoman Porter, to Congresswoman Spanberger, and Congressman Gottheimer. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And now we have time for a couple of questions. A couple of our speakers may have to run because we know you all are very busy, but thank you all again for joining us. And our first question is going to be from Ella Nilsson from CNN. Ella, you should be off mute in just a second if you're not already.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for doing this call. I wanted to ask, especially to some of the moderate members on this call, some of the options that have been floated in the Senate for kind of a future Build Back Better in recent days, I think is sort of a climate first rather than a climate only bill. So I wanted to ask you guys, what you think about that. And secondly, and if you would be supportive of, really kind of centering climate as the main thing going forward. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you is, especially as Senator Joe Manchin has said that he is supportive of the climate and clean energy provisions. I mean, have you guys been in touch with him at all? Are you urging him to, kind of come to some sort of agreement around this, and what you sort of think the urgency is to get this passed before the midterms? Thank you very much.
You want me to start, Tiernan?
That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. This has been a top priority for the new Dem coalition. We had 4 top priorities for Build Back Better. Going big on climate was one of those top 4, so it's always been a top priority of ours. And another goal has been making sure that we focus and do things well for longer, because we know when we look at an issue like climate, this is something that is a long-term investment for long-term change in our communities. And that has been a priority. And I think that is an option for us going forward as we look at pulling Build Back Better, pulling together the coalition around that in the House and the Senate, is to make sure that there's focus and we have that long-term durable policy that families, communities, small businesses, workers can count on. So clearly, as I said earlier, we need 218 votes in the House, we need 50 in the Senate. And that's the goal in all the conversations that we're having. And I do, and I think my colleagues all share that sense of urgency that the sooner we get a bill to the president's desk, the sooner we'll start seeing the change we need. And last thing I want to throw in there, passing an omnibus is also critical because there's many things we can do to help address climate that are part of the funding package, and we got to move off of a CR, get a funding package through. Thanks.
Would anyone else like to quickly jump in on this before we go to 2 more quick questions? Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Congressman Spanberger, please.
Well, I would just make the comment that, looking at any of the things, any of the elements, and I don't know why I'm so blurry, so I apologize to everyone. Looking at the elements of what were included in the Build Back Better framework that we passed out of the House, if we passed any of those singular items in isolation, they would represent extraordinary progress and impact on people, whether it's lowering the cost of prescription drugs, extending the refundable child tax credit, universal pre-K, climate provisions, as sort of the pillars of the most notable of the largest elements of that bill. And so, I think moving forward, it's important that we all look at, we put forth the legislation that is what we wanted to see pass out of the Senate, but in individual forms. And so, any step forward we are taking on the elements that are not climate related have incredible impact on people. And so I think that it isn't necessarily, it's not an either or, it's a, let's recognize the value of these programs that we passed and let's try to move forward with them. But I think that in this discussion, it's clear that so many of us really do see the focus of climate as being just tangential to all of the portions that we're, all of the good that we're trying to do, all of the progress we're trying to make with that bill.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So we're going to go to Eric Garcia and then to Lindsay McPherson, and then we're going to be out of time. I apologize to all of the reporters who are not able to ask your questions verbally, but we are happy to follow up with you offline. But Eric, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much to the League of Conservation Voters and to all the members for being here. Quick question. You mentioned prioritizing climate, and the president has said that we might have to break off past big. He might have to pass Build Back Better in big chunks. What are some non-negotiables that you are seeing that this coalition would see as these are the only things that could pass? I know that Representative Gottheimer has said he doesn't want to see it pass without a SALT deduction change. Are there any things that you would find acceptable to not be included if it meant passing climate provisions?
Well, let me take a stab at this. I mean, I think one of the things that's come across in this call, and it comes across in conversations that I'm having with Republicans and Democrats in the very purple district that I represent, is they understand the relationship between taking action on climate and, for example, having good high-paying jobs for their kids for the future. So it's not as simple as saying this is a bucket, that is a bucket. I think that is a very sort of DC Congress committee-driven way of thinking about it. We're all on different committees and we know that that's somehow we get into it. But you heard Jahana talk about the idling in school buses. I'm a parent of 3 kids. I've been in that school bus line and it is not the cleanest air I've ever breathed. So I think that, there's not so much like anything that we put away. It's just, I think, asking ourselves, how do these pieces fit together? So if you're saying that we need to bring down costs for families, then that means, and we need to pay for anything we do needs to be fiscally responsible. That means stopping taxpayer subsidies to big oil. That is part of how we pay for the climate investments that we need to make. So it's the same thing when we talk about lowering the price of prescription drugs. Do you know what's very, very expensive to have? Asthma. Do you know how we reduce the incidence of asthma in the first place? We address air pollution. So I think that on the ground, my constituents understand that climate and environmental protection, yes, it is an issue about those topics, but they also see, for instance, if you're having natural disasters and wildfires, you don't have any tourism, you don't have the economic growth, you're not able to create jobs to compete with China, commutes are longer, gas prices go up if we're dependent solely on gas-powered vehicles. So I think that one of the strengths is the fact that we've helped, and we need to keep doing this, showing the American people how these things fit together and that it's not a choice between one and the other, but in fact, they work in tandem to bring down costs, to create jobs, and to make sure we have the best future we can have for our country and for our kids. And I think it's the connection between them that's really the brilliance of this policy and why it's going to be so important in setting the stage, not just for next year, but for the next 10 years or 20 years of American policy.
Couldn't agree more, Congresswoman Porter. It's win, win, win. We're going to go to our last question from Lindsay with roll call.
Hi, thanks for hosting the call today and taking my question. I just wanted to ask, because you all spoke about the urgency of passing these climate provisions as part of Build Back Better. Is there a specific date that you think Congress needs to act by? I know some of the progressives have called for by the State of the Union, and it's a campaign year, so obviously the longer things drag out, the harder it is typically to get things done. So just wondering if you guys have any deadlines in mind.
Well, I'll just say this. I think if Congress had a slogan kind of institutionally, it would be something like solving yesterday's problems tomorrow, maybe. So the time is now because the problems are now, right? So we know that if we do not, for instance, as my colleague Representative DelBene pointed out, if we do not pass an omnibus budget, a lot of the things that we did with infrastructure, including to combat and prevent wildfires, won't necessarily go into effect. So, I think any date is obviously subject to what we can get done. But I do think that, Congress's mind and, it focuses the mind to set deadlines. The State of the Union is a major moment in which the president is going to have the attention of the American people and be able to communicate with them. So I don't think it's about any particular date, but the answer is today, tomorrow, the day after, as soon as we can get it done, because as we've said, and I think you heard this from Representative Gottheimer, who's very different than I am in terms of some of our other beliefs and how we talk about issues, it gets more expensive and more difficult. And we risk falling farther behind our competitors if we wait. So I think the sooner we can get this done, the better for the health and well-being of the American people and for our economy.
Thank you so much to all of our incredible speakers. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. The time is now. Let's get this done. Take care, everybody.